What's up guys, my name is Josh and welcome to a review of the K7XX from Massdrop. Now before we get into this, I do want to announce the winner of the Odyssey cable, Mr. Wade Robson from Canada. Now quick secret is Wade was really not supposed to enter, but he did anyway, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and give the cable to Wade. Wade, hit me up and let me know if you like the cable when it gets there. And then one final thing is that I do want to disclose that Massdrop did send me this item to review. They're not paying me, but they did give it to me for free for me to do with what I choose. They have not paid, asked, or otherwise tried to influence me to give this a good or bad review. So I'm going to give this an unbiased review. I have some things I love about this and things that I don't really like about it that much. Now last thing before we jump in is that I will actually have a comparison between the K7XX and the 6XX, both from Massdrop. So that being said, let's go ahead and start off with sound. So with this headphone, what's the general sound signature of this? It's very wide, it is slightly warm, but it does have a little bit of a sparkle in the high end. Now, it isn't as wide as the K712s from what I can remember. And if you don't know, this model is actually based off of the K702. So these are slightly less wide than the K712s, but they're also not as warm as like the 4XXs, for example. They're definitely wider than the 6XXs, if that gives you any point of reference whatsoever. Hopefully it does. So speaking of warmth, let's talk about the bass response of this headphone because I find it very interesting. If you look at a frequency response graph, it does kind of have a lower mid-range to kind of upper bass response kind of hump. It's kind of a very gradual slope upwards and then kind of slopes a little bit downwards as you get lower and lower in the frequencies, and kind of slopes downwards as you get higher towards kind of the middle of the mid-range area. And I find this very interesting because the delivery of the headphone is very wide, so although bass is there, it's definitely audible. It's not super intense. So like with the LCD2Cs, for example, they have a somewhat emphasized bass response, sort of similar to this. It's not majorly emphasized or anything like that, but the way that the delivery is and having it so intimate, that bass response comes across very, very intense. With this particular headphone, the bass is still there. It's very audible. It's very clean sounding, but it's not super in your face. It's not forcing you to listen and to feel the bass at all times. So you get bass response, and this makes bass response seem very, I would almost call it natural in a sort of way. Like, you know, when like deep guitars hit or something like that, they have a substantial amount of bass to them, but it's not completely overemphasized. Despite what the frequency response graph might lead you to kind of believe. It doesn't really feel too bloomed out. There's a little bit of bloom around the 80 to 100 hertz area to where it feels kind of a little too much compared to below that and above that. But overall, it's a pretty good bass response, I would say. And it's deep, it's smooth, but it does blend in well into the mid-range. Now, the mid-range is kind of a mixed bag. You get this deeper, lower mid-range, and that's pretty nice. And then it kind of slopes down a little bit. Now the mid-range is smooth and continues with that kind of slightly elevated feel in the lower mid-range. So when you come across like male vocals, those can seem particularly assertive and very, very forward. When you get to female vocals tend to pull back a little bit. The upper mid-range tends to dip down enough to where the female vocalists just kind of take a step back compared to the male vocalists. And male vocals tend to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of the delivery of the sound. It seems to be a little bit more intense. Now, it never is as intense as something like the 6XX is here, but compared to female vocals to male vocals generally do a little bit better on this headphone. Female vocals definitely have a little bit of sweetness to them for sure. The female vocals aren't bad. Regarding headphone soundstage, they sound relatively natural in terms of a headphone soundstage to where they feel like part of the music. Now, I'll talk more about soundstage in a second because that's a big part of how things come across on this headphone. But I do want to talk about the treble because I like the bass response and I like the mid-range response. I wish there was maybe a tad bit more for female vocals, but it's definitely still enjoyable. And you know, comparing against the 6XX, which I'll do in its own separate review, most things kind of fall a little bit apart compared to the vocals of that headphone. But the mid-range and especially vocals seem to be interrupted by some of the high notes. Now let me explain that. So the high notes can be occasionally sharp, and they have a deceptively large peak between about 7 to 10K, where certain instruments, when they play in the background, especially anything that has a really extended top range, and not just extended as in going very high up in frequency, but extended as in a very kind of long note up in those top frequencies. Think like something like drums or really kind of screechy instruments, maybe like a violin. Occasionally that can seem pretty intense, and especially not so much with violins. Violins tend to go more towards the sweet side, but with drums, those can be a little bit brutal sometimes. And on a personal note, sometimes when I was listening to vocals and you'd have kind of these instruments in the background, the instruments, especially if they were kind of higher note instruments, they were kind of interrupting the vocals quite a bit. A song that I used to test both the low end interruption and the high end interruption is John Legend's Surefire. Very intense vocals. I brought this song up before, but very intense vocals. But then you get these kind of low parts of the song that have just this really deep bass in the background. And if it's overpowering the vocals, it's a problem. And it wasn't a problem on this particular headphone. But then there's other parts of the song where they do the same thing, but with high notes rather than low notes. And if those start interrupting the vocals like they did on this headphone, it is cause for concern. Now, while the high notes, in my opinion, to what I like, aren't working towards the benefit of this headphone for music, this is an exceptional gaming headphone. And I mean exceptional. I think back when I reviewed the K712s, which I didn't like, to be honest. I didn't like the K712s. I do like these as an overall headphone. The K712s were some of the best gaming headphones, but I couldn't warrant purchasing. I think at the time of recording, they were like $350 or $400, and I thought that was way too high for the sound signature and way too high even for a designated gaming headphone. These come in about $200. That's a lot more reasonable, and in my opinion, they're a lot more enjoyable for music, but for gaming, they're incredible. And a big part of that is to do with those high notes that I was talking about and to do with the soundstage and the imaging. Now, I'll reapproach the high notes in a second and explain all that stuff. But for now, the imaging in the soundstage is very interesting. The imaging is very tight for such a wide headphone. Now, in comparison, again, to the 6XXs, are they as tight as the 6XXs for the totality of imaging? No. I would say you get like 95% of the tightness on this headphone compared to that headphone. But the soundstage on this headphone is significantly wider, and things do have a very good ability of seeming very far away, and they do image in front of you fairly well as well. So we know that wide soundstage with tight imaging is good for gaming. Now, why are the high notes important? Well, the high notes are important for kind of, I hesitate to use this term, but immersion of, gunshots, especially on a game like Arma 3, which has just incredible audio performance. Those gunshots sound insane on this headphone. And this adds to not only realism and enjoyment, but also the ability to feel like you're listening accurately to the world around you. And this has more to do with the imaging in the soundstage of being able to feel like you can really isolate and locate an enemy purely based off of the sound. And I could definitely do that a lot more often, and a big part of that factor was the distance factor. See, with the HC 650s here, like I have a mod mic on them. I do game with these occasionally, and I can usually, well, not usually, I can always tell where an enemy is coming from in terms of direction. But what this headphone seems to lack is the depth of that direction. Are they 5 feet away from me? Are they 10 feet away from me? Are they 20 feet away from me? That's where the soundstage and imaging of this becomes valuable, of being able to tell distance as well as direction. And that's when you can know, okay, like they're going to come around the corner now. And so for gaming, I felt this is really, really good. And I know not all of you care about gaming, but I feel like there's a big enough portion of my audience that is going to ask and maybe consider it and maybe want to know. And I think that this is an excellent gaming headphone and a decent to good musical headphone. It's got a few problems, but it does some things very, very well. And if you're a person who really likes wide soundstage in your music, this is going to be a great headphone. So if that sounds like something that's interesting to you, what do you get in terms of this headphone? What can you expect with this? It is a plastic build. It's entirely made of plastic. The cups themselves do feel solid, but the hinge mechanism doesn't feel particularly fantastic, nor particularly flimsy. It's kind of right in the middle. The headband does have a good amount of clamp force. You got these huge, massive ear cups. Not sure if you can make this out, but that's, that's a big ear cup. Do I have anything for reference? Like, here's an AirPod versus my ear, and then that AirPod just fits like right in there. No problem in terms of fit. You could fit pretty much anybody's ears in this. Now I know some people, because of how big these actually are and how far down on the jaw they go, some people would complain about kind of jaw pressure, but the clamp force is so light. Like, it's enough to keep them on your head, but this isn't really a heavy headphone to begin with, so they don't need much. It's enough to keep it on your head, but it's not like crushing or anything like that. And before anybody says anything, no, I don't listen with my hat on. Now, the headband out of the box is not the most pliable. It kind of feels like cardboardy, but it does break in over time. It does get a little bit more comfortable. It does kind of conform to, rather than feeling a flat line on top of your head, it does kind of round a little bit more. Massdrop does offer a black variant like this, and they also offer a variant that's mostly black with a little bit of red highlights. So what would you need to power this headphone? So it's got an impedance rating of 62 ohms and a sensitivity level of 105 decibels. So with this headphone, an amplifier is not absolutely required, but like with most headphones, it is recommended. And it does have enough resolution to really benefit from using an amplifier and getting a little bit extra detail, or maybe a little bit of a flavor change if you go with tubes. Okay, so my overall conclusion, this is a good headphone for music. I do enjoy this headphone. This isn't a poor headphone in my opinion. I do like it quite a bit. And for a wide soundstage, it can be a lot of fun. It's exceptional for gaming. And I mean exceptional for gaming. It's probably the best. So the only other headphones that I would really recommend for gaming over this would be SHP 9500s, but those kind of go in and out of stock, and when they are in stock, they're usually about the same price as this, and I think this is a better overall headphone. Now, even though this is a nearly perfect gaming headphone as an overall headphone, it isn't entirely perfect. It does have kind of a little bit of what I would consider to be an issue with the high end, but it is still a very enjoyable headphone. So overall, considering all the factors, the cost, the sound, the performance, what it's good at, what it's bad at, I'm gonna give this an 8 out of 10. It is a good headphone, but it is not a perfect headphone. That being said, I do wanna thank Massdrop for sending this headphone out for me to review. I appreciate you guys. Thanks very much for helping me make this channel possible. If you do want to support the channel, if you are a viewer, there's Patreon links down below. If you do support what I do and you want me to continue to do it and you want to help with that, that helps a lot, and I appreciate every single one of my patrons. Thank you guys very much. I think that's going to wrap it up. Stay tuned for a HD 6XX versus K7XX comparison video. That should be a lot of fun, and Massdrop did send me some other items that I will be reviewing in the future, so if that sounds interesting, go ahead and click that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.